Scott Helman was a Boston Globe reporter when the Boston Marathon bombing happened and has written a definitive book about it called The Long Mile Home with his colleague Jenna Russell. And Scott now joins us on the phone as well. Scott, good to talk to you.
Great to be here.
This must be an emotional day for you, knowing the ins and outs and the details of this case the way you have. What was it like to hear the words from Dzhokar Tsarnaev, "I would like to apologize to the victims and to the survivors"?
Well, I think it was quite unexpected and quite riveting. I mean, this is the first display of remorse that he has had since the trial began months ago. And I think a lot of people thought that if he was going to say anything like this, it would have happened in the penalty phase, because that, after all, that's when it helps you, right? I mean, you look to the jury, and if you're remorseful and you're apologizing, you're saying, I don't know what I did and I'm sorry and all that, you have a better chance of getting off. I'm not sure now what it really does for him, but I think, by all accounts, this was one of the most memorable moments, I think, of the entire, legal process.
The interesting part of this is that he did not take the stand in the penalty phase, as you said, before the jury came to their decision to pass on the death penalty. And yet he said today, when his statement probably will have no impact on what happens to him in the months and years to come, that after the bombing, he learned his victims' names, he saw their faces, he found out how old they were. He was really listening as these people testified. And it seems like that made a difference to him. And yet reporters who've been sitting in that courtroom day in and day out have described no emotion other than the one day his aunt from Russia took the stand in his defense, that day he wiped away a tear, but that's it. Do you think that he just had a problem showing the emotion? Do you think that that the weight of the death penalty is coming down? Now, again, I know I'm asking you to speculate in this case, but knowing the ins and outs the way you do, what does your gut tell you about why now?
I mean, it's puzzling, isn't it? Because you're right. I mean, throughout the entire trial, the guilt phase and then the penalty phase, he was always described as being, disinterested or bored or pulling on his beard or sitting back in the chair like he'd want to be anywhere else, with no sign at all, of any kind of even recognition, really, other than that strange moment, as you say, with the relative. And yet here we are, when it's meaningless, utterly, at the very end, where at least legally meaningless, when he finally says, "I'm sorry and I've caused harm," and I can't say what is going through his head. I don't know if it's genuine or if it's strategic, though again it's hard to see at this point strategically how it would help him in any kind of appeal process. But one thing, it was clear. I mean, he said he heard his victims and he heard about them and heard about their lives. I mean, it was hard not to, because there was a parade of suffering that prosecutors put up there, and maybe it just finally got through to him at the end.
Scott, we're watching outside the courthouse right now, sort of the media who've gathered around looking for the reactions from the people who were inside the courthouse. Many of those were survivors or families of survivors, families who lost people in the Boston Marathon bombing. What has it been like for you watching the justice part of this phase? I mean, again, you wrote the book on it. You have the inside stories from Crystal Campbell's family, who lost her life as she was cheering on runners. You talked to the trauma surgeon who ran and finished the marathon and then went and did 10 hours of surgery straight, and then who helped President Obama get ready for his visits with those same survivors. What was it like for you to hear the justice part of this?
Well, I think we have been hearing about the impacts of these bombings on families for more than 2 years now, right? I mean, both in the reporting of our book and all the reporting that the Globe and other papers have done, and then of course through the the trial and so forth. And yet, so we've heard it over and over, and yet it never loses its power. I mean, even today, when you see the Richard family up there describing how they're choosing peace and choosing love, and you see Crystal Campbell's mother and father up there still wrestling with this. I mean, it never goes away, and it's just a reminder that it's never going to go away for them. I mean, there is no closure, I don't think, for any of these people.
I'm struck by you saying that, Scott, that earlier this week, just a couple days ago, we heard from the families of people killed in Charleston. And right away, in the very first initial bail hearing for Dylan Roof, they got up and said, "We forgive you, hate won't win." And, you know, it's easy to think, well, maybe they're still in shock, maybe they don't understand. But here's families who've had 2 years now to come to some sort of conclusion about whether they will hate or whether they will forgive. And again, Denise Richards, who lost her little boy, as a mother of little boys, I cannot imagine her heartbreak. It makes me want to weep when I see his face, and yet she's choosing forgiveness and choosing love, choosing peace. It's so striking that families can find that path within them. You know, I want to mention as well, while we're talking to you, Scott, we're just getting in new sketches from the courthouse today. And here's Dzhokar Tsarnaev, the court artist rendering of him when he was giving his statement today. Quite different from the very young-looking man that we first saw in the mugshots and in that detention video where he's flipping off the cameras. I mean, this is a much more somber, much more serious, a bearded Tsarnaev, and in this pose, looking pensive and thoughtful. The description from WBZ's reporter after the judge sentenced him to death today was that he leaned back in his chair and slumped down with his head, and was handcuffed by the U.S. Marshal and led out of the courthouse, which may possibly be the last time he'll ever be seen in public again. Scott?
Yeah, that's right. And as you say, I mean, it's possible that the weight of this has finally kind of come down on his shoulders. You know, this is a reality check of some kind. I mean, it's hard to imagine that it hadn't at all these other points when it was clear what he was facing, but maybe it was cathartic in some strange way, in his own way, for him to have a chance to talk today. And I mean, I think the judge is absolutely right in this case that no one's going to remember the, you know, kind of good parts of him, the good warm memories of him as a young boy and so forth. I mean, he will be remembered forever for one thing, and whether or not he is executed in the near term or whether or not he, you know, dies in prison, I mean, that will always be true.
Rebecca Gregory lost her leg on April 15th, 2013. And she got up and she addressed Tsarnaev directly. She said, terrorists like you do two things in the world. One, they create mass destruction. But the second is quite interesting, she said, because do you know what mass destruction really does? It brings people together. We are Boston strong. We are America strong. And choosing to mess with us was a terrible idea. How's Boston moving on from this?
You know, I think we have in a lot of ways. I mean, I think had he not spoken today, I mean, the hearing would have been, I mean, it's very much pro forma. It's not like it was a surprise. We knew he was going to get the death sentence. It's just like we knew he was guilty. There wasn't much, you know, drama there at the end. I think the jolt, of course, are his words. So I think that will take some processing, but I think Boston has already moved on. I mean, obviously, I'm speaking for the people who are not directly affected. I mean, I think one of the things you heard today is you heard from people who were not necessarily physically affected, but emotionally affected, or you know, physically affected to the extent that it just changed their brains and they suffer from PTSD. And you know, those kind of injuries are going to last maybe forever, if not certainly a long time. But I think for those of us who weren't directly touched by it, you know, I think it has faded into history a little bit. I think with every passing marathon, we get back to normal a little bit, though, of course, you never forget those people. You never forget what they went through, and I don't think the city will ever, you know, fully get past it.
Scott Helman, author of the book Long Mile Home, along with his Boston Globe colleague Jenna Russell. Scott, thank you so much for your time today, your insight and your perspective on this.